Good morning. If you have a New Testament handy, turn with me to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. And we'll look once again at the scripture reading read in your hearing just a moment ago. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit. The diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Some of what Jesus has said here has made its way at various times into popular culture. When I was a young man, and even going back into my childhood, I think several decades ago, we would go to the movies, go to the theater, and they would have these cartoons that would play before the main feature. And there was this one cartoon theme that kept replaying again and again, and it had to do with a wolf that tried to snatch a sheep from the flock, and you would have a sheepdog. And kind of like the Roadrunner with Wile E. Coyote, the sheepdog had a 100% batting or 1,000 batting average. He would always win those, and the humor was in the fact that the wolf would always get beaten up or self-destruct in one way or another. And I think that cartoon theme came right out of Matthew 7. The uh, wolf would dress up and play sheep in his effort to get the sheep. Another example, even though the outward veneer in this case is not another sheep, but you all know the story. My, what big teeth you have. Little Red Riding Hood. I believe that there are elements of that that come right out of Matthew 7. As Jesus closes the Sermon on the Mount, he essentially concludes with a call to action, with a choice, with an invitation, if you will. And that invitation involves two ways, verses 13 and 14. Two types of teachers, verses 15 through 20. Two types of confessional plea, verses 21 through 23. And two foundations on which we can build a life. And we are now at the juncture of verses 15 through 20, two teachers. And so Jesus warns his disciples of false teachers. If you're going to implement all of these wonderful divine strategies in your life to be a kingdom citizen, there are going to be pretenders and counterfeit practitioners who influence people far and wide. And so in the next few minutes, we want to spend part of our time looking at how to identify false teachers, and secondly, how to overcome them. So first of all, in regard to identifying them, we're dealing with a battle for the mind. 1 Timothy 4:1 speaks of deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons. There's a larger theater of operation than we sometimes took for granted years ago. Whenever I heard about false teachers when I was growing up in the church, it was usually about various denominationalists that were on the wrong path. I rarely heard about false teachers in Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam, and I certainly heard nothing about false teaching in secular ideologies. It's a whole new playing field these days, and it's much more complex. We're dealing with a battle for the mind on so many different fronts these days. Battle for ideological control of people, a battle for people's ultimate loyalty, a battle for people's hearts and allegiance. And individuals like you and me, we're caught up in the crossfire. But make no mistake about it, whatever the ideology, whatever the challenge, Satan is a master of manipulation, the father of lies. He is an absolute mastermind of propaganda, groupthink, ideological control. No one does it better than he does. If he wants to poison your life and to control you, all he has to do is poison your thought process, to infiltrate, and to get you to think differently so that you behave differently or go down the wrong path, go down the path of least resistance, as opposed to the straight and narrow way that he speaks of in verses 13 and 14. Paul speaks of evil people and impostors who go on from bad to worst, deceiving and being deceived. 2 Timothy 3:13. That's a sad commentary. Deceiving and being deceived. But that's part of the carnage that occurs when we're caught up in the battle for ideological control of people. And there is no conflict-free zone. There was never a time in biblical history, after Adam and Eve at least, in which people have lived in a utopia free from the crossfire of truth versus error. There's never been a time when God's people were not locked in a controversy between truth and what is counterfeit. There were false prophets, Jeremiah 23, false apostles, 2 Corinthians 11:13, false teachers, 2 Peter 2:1, false Christs, Matthew 24:24, 1 John 2, false brothers, Galatians 2 and verse 4. And the commonality between all of these, there's something fundamentally deceitful and counterfeit about the representations being made. In 2 Timothy 3:8, Paul says, these men also oppose the truth, men corrupted in mind and disqualified regarding the faith. In 1 Timothy 6:5, he speaks of those who are depraved in mind and deprived of the truth. That's a bad 1-2 punch. Depraved in mind and deprived of the truth. So when we're dealing with false teaching, make no mistake about it, there's something more sinister at stake than simply making an honest mistake. Apollos is not called a false teacher in so many words. Even when Priscilla and Aquila took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Acts 18:26. When you're dealing with false teachers, you're dealing with those like those that Paul speaks of in Galatians 2 and verse 4, false brothers who had secretly infiltrated our ranks to spy out our freedom and bring us into slavery. Again, ideological control is in view here. Or 2 Corinthians 11, verse 13, where he describes others as false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. He says in the next verse that even Satan appears as an angel of light. That's scary. There's an outer facade which betrays the hideous nature of what exists on the inside. In 2 Peter chapter 2, you have an entire chapter devoted to false teaching. And what Peter essentially says in that chapter is that false teachers are rotten to the core. Their message is false, their character is false, everything about them is false, including their motives and their tactics. Read with me 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, because in many respects it's parallel to what Jesus says here in Matthew 7. 2 Peter 2, 1 through 3. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who brought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. These are not just innocent people who've gone astray a few notches. They are secretly bringing in destructive heresies, heresies that are destroying people. Many are following their sensuality. They're greedy. They exploit people with their words, their false words, and they themselves will be destroyed. Notice in these verses their pervasiveness, their method of operation, how hideous and counterfeit it is, how evil it is, corrupt, their sudden destruction, their widespread influence. Many will follow them. The reproach they bring on the church in their exploitation of the naive. Again, we live in an age in which religious ideology takes on so many different forms. When people are in denial of God, when they're in denial of the Bible, they end up in many cases taking on religious faith commitments, pseudo-religious faith commitments, if you will, that are more secular in nature. As someone has said, people who believe nothing will fall for anything. People with such blind faith in a system, whatever it may be, and fervor to stamp out all dissent without a fair hearing, that's a religious impulse. And it may come from even secular sources. There are false religions, so-called Christian denominations, government agencies, and totalitarian regimes. One of the most interesting chapters in Eric Metaxas' book, Bonhoeffer, is a chapter called Nazi Theology, in which the Nazis tried to control the churches in Germany during the World War II period and preceding that. I've read recently that even in current China, there is a systematic removal in state-sponsored churches of various symbols associated, historically at least, with Christianity, replacing those symbols with pictures of government authorities. And then side by side with that, a systematic sweeping attempt at arresting people in house churches across that country. There's definitely persecution in the world today, and definitely false teaching that goes under many banners. But what they all have in common is lies and demanding allegiance to those lies. And what Peter warns us about is what Jesus warns us about in Matthew chapter 7. They are wolves in sheep's clothing. The Apostle Paul, in his parting words to the elders of Ephesus in Acts 20, he says there in verses 29 and 30, I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away disciples after them. Wolves in sheep's clothing, not sparing the flock. Those who distort the gospel, which is an objective standard. We're to measure truth versus error by the words of Jesus. And he says so in the same context of Matthew 7, verse 24. Everyone, therefore, who hears these words of mine and does not and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. Verse 26. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. You have an objective barometer by which we measure truth versus error. These words of mine. It's the same barometer that you see in the narrow way versus the path of least resistance. These people are disguise themselves in order to deceive. And so there's no place for the people of God to live in a comfortable echo chamber. We need to challenge each other, and we need to be challenged continually. What does 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5 say? Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Or do you not know this about you, how that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail the test? Someone says there are many roads to God. Are there? Is that what you read in Matthew 7, 13, and 14 when you're reading about a narrow path, a narrow way versus the broad way? Again, counterfeit Christianity takes on many forms. The Apostle Paul warns us in 2 Timothy 4, verses 2 through 5, preach the word, be ready in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with complete patience and teaching, for the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. As for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. False teachers are a clear and existential threat to our spiritual survival. We need to be aware of them. We need to be acutely putting our antennas up and to test them. But how do you do? How do you overcome the pervasiveness of false teaching in this world? Counterfeit Christianity that exists so pervasively. Jesus gives us a formula by which we can be successful. You test them by their fruits. When I preached down in Orange County years ago in Tustin, California, we had an FDA fruit tester in the congregation, and he gave a talk on this one time. I can remember it. How that it was his job to test good fruit versus bad fruit and approve certain kinds of fruit and disapprove others. And he made some interesting analogies. The idea here is that a person's heart on the inside is revealed by his conduct, character, and words on the outside. False teachers don't wear a banner that says false teacher. They often have a whole lot of charisma. They often know how to draw a huge crowd. They know how to say things in a polished way. And you really have to search beneath the surface to see the rottenness on the inside that cannot necessarily be seen on the outside. You know a tree by its fruit. I can look at an orange tree and a lemon tree and maybe not be able to tell the difference until I see, one bears this yellow fruit and the other bears this orange fruit, and know what kind of tree that is. I'm not a tree expert by any stretch of the imagination. But Jesus goes on to say, in the same context, that grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles. Healthy trees bear healthy fruit, unhealthy trees bear bad fruit. And so you have to be a good fruit tester. What that means is that people who are false teachers don't have a lot of goodness on the inside. They can draw up from the bucket only what goes down into the well, as one preacher once said. If you put bad in, you're going to get bad out. You put good in, you get good out. And that's true of a person's character to a large extent. When you look at the character of the Beatitudes, for example, Matthew 5, poor in spirit, mourning, meekness, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, purity of heart, merciful, peacemaking with the message of God, persecuted for the sake of righteousness and the sake of Jesus. False teachers usually don't specialize in those character traits. It's kind of like the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5:22 and 23. Of love, peace, joy, all the others that Paul speaks of there. What you usually see in false teachers, if you look beneath the hood long enough and hard enough, is this pride. Puffed up, arrogant, ego, and pride. You don't see a humility and a hunger for God most of the time. But even if you cannot diagnose the character, you certainly should be able to diagnose the teaching. And that's the most important thing here. The teaching is false. In Matthew 12:33 through 37, Jesus takes up this same topic. He says, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For the tree is known by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. For the good person out of the good treasure brings forth good. The evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. So even if you can't measure the character of a false teacher very well, you can certainly judge what comes out of his mouth. Jordan preached on Matthew 7:1 through 6, judge not that you be not judged. Some of the most perverted words in the Bible misquoted completely out of context. In the context, you have the idea of not judging the speck or the splinter in your brother's eye when you've got a telephone pole hanging out of your own eye. First, address your issue so you can see clearly to address your brother's issue. But this is not a blanket condemnation of making assessments. Verse 6 speaks of dogs and pigs. Don't cast your pearls before swine. Don't give what is holy to dogs. Verses 15 through 20 speaks of false teachers. You need to identify them by their fruits. You cannot do that without making assessments, without putting your antennas up and differentiating between truth and error. We have an obligation to do that, and nothing in the judge not, you be not judged, says otherwise. That cuts to the chase of application for kingdom citizens among those who are brothers and sisters in Christ. These are difficult applications to make, and we need to be very patient with each other, forgiving even. But when it comes to false teaching, this is not a blanket endorsement of sweeping blatant false teaching and sin under the rug, not by any stretch of the imagination. There are many other passages that speak to this issue. 1 John, one of the last books of the New Testament, says in chapter 4, verse 1, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world." John says in verse 6, "We are from God. Whoever knows God listens to us. Whoever is not from God does not listen to us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error." You have the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 1. He says there in verses 8 and 9, "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so say I now again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed." Or again, going back to John, this time 2 John, verses 9 through 11, "Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God." That's strong language. "Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. For whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works." So there's a call to differentiate, a call to identify, a call to mark out those who are not bringing the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. There must be a clear line drawn. This is an ominous warning Jesus gives us. Paul in 2 Timothy 2 and 17 speaks of false teachers whose talk will spread like gangrene. It's a cancerous influence that must be cut off for our survival. This is a clear and present danger, an existential threat. False teachers may be popular, they may be successful, but they're certainly not right, no matter how popular and successful they may be in drawing up a crowd. With a newfold gospel or a magnetic personality or a deviant teaching, these things kill people spiritually. So, how can we overcome? We must follow the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," Jesus teaches in John 8:24. And it's only the truth that will give us confidence in the end to face God. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" Matthew 7:21 through 23. And in all this, I want to say this finally, that we are not insulated from this problem. It's not just them. This is a potential threat for us as well. There's no room for snobbery or a judgmental spirit of others because they're the ones who have all the false teachers and we don't. No, we're not immune from this. We are vulnerable to false teaching just like they are if we're not careful. But we must have the attitude, the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Investigate it honestly, investigate it to the logical conclusions. Bill Cruz wrote this little piece decades ago, and I'd like to read it to you to wrap up the sermon this morning. It's called Give Me the Truth. If you are my friend, if you are concerned about my soul, give me the truth. Do not flatter me. Do not praise my virtues while remaining silent about my vices. Do not fear the truth will offend me. Do not treasure our friendship, our friendly relations above my salvation. Do not think that by ignoring my sins you can help me. Do not think that being blind to my sins will prove you charitable. However I may react to it, whatever may be my attitude toward you after you have done it, give me the truth. For the truth and only the truth can make me free from the shackles of sin, strengthen me in the pathway of righteousness, and lead me to the joys of heaven. If I am wavering, weak, lukewarm, indifferent, neglectful, if I have been overtaken in a trespass, if I have been drawn into the pleasures of this world, if I have left my first love, if I have been led astray by error, or if I have done none of these things but simply need to grow in knowledge and then be edified, give me the truth. If you're subject to the invitation of Christ, you need to put on Christ and his truth. There's no better time than now. If you need to be baptized for the forgiveness of every sin, do it now. You need to come back to the Lord and his truth. Do it now. Do it today. We can help you. Let's stand and sing a song of encouragement to each other to do just that.